Tyson played away from Hart. Here's Reinhardt on the counter. Sam Reinhardt scores!
When one thinks of hockey, well, more accurately ice hockey, the first thing that probably comes to most people's minds is the largest hockey league in the world, the NHL, and the two countries associated with the NHL, USA and Canada. Today, the NHL has the best players, the largest salaries, and by far the most fans out of any hockey league in the world. Therefore, it should not be surprising that the NHL is always the main topic of conversation when it comes to modern hockey, which in turn is the reason why many histories of hockey are often just the history of the game in North America. Most hockey history books and documentaries talk about the history of the Stanley Cup, which is largely the history of the game as it evolved and developed in Canada and expanded into the USA. But that is just one story of a game that has many stories, including an East Asian one and a European one. It is the European side of the story of ice hockey that I would like to share with you today, because as much as hockey can seem like just a North American phenomenon due to the dominance of the NHL in modern hockey culture, European hockey, with its past dating as far back as the Middle Ages, has just as rich of a history as North American hockey does. Ice hockey fundamentally involves two historically separate activities, that of ice skating and stick handling. Ice skating in Europe has been around for millennia, with the oldest skates found in Europe dating back to circa 2500 BCE. These prehistoric skates, rather than using metal blades, used sharpened pieces of bone attached to a shoe. As far as we can tell, early ice skating was used primarily as a form of transportation in the winter. However, there were times when it was also used as a form of entertainment during the long winter months. As William Fitzstephen writes in the 12th century, kids in London that were more skilled at frolicking on the ice equip each of their feet with an animal's shin bone, attaching it to the underside of their footwear. Using handheld poles reinforced with metal tips, which they periodically thrust against the ice, they propel themselves along as swiftly as a bird in flight or a bolt shot from a crossbow. The technique of skating explained here, that is the use of poles to propel oneself, was the most common skating technique used in Europe in the Middle Ages. However, by the 16th century, a new skating style had started to develop, where people used solely the strength of their feet to push themselves forward. This change in skating styles was facilitated by the invention of metal skates, which made it easier to use your legs to push off the ice. When it comes to tracing the history of the stick handling side of modern ice hockey, here we have to look at the history of what are called stick and ball games. Stick and ball games, just like ice skating, have been around for millennia. There are accounts of games played with a ball and a curved stick in ancient Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire, and these games continued to be played in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. However, no codified rules existed for these games, with each town and village having its own rules for how their particular version of a stick and ball game should be played. At what point did someone somewhere in Europe decide to combine the two activities of ice skating and a stick and ball game? We will never know. However, since the 16th century onwards, as metal skates became more prominent, paintings started to emerge that clearly show a stick and ball game being played on ice, sometimes with skates and sometimes without. These early on-ice stick and ball games were just as disorganized as the on-land stick and ball games. They had no standardized rules, equipment, or a name, but they were played all across early modern Europe during the winter. Some of the various names for on-ice stick and ball games in Europe included bandy, shinty, shinny, ice polo, hurley, etc. But without a doubt, the most used word was simply hockey, as most Europeans called called any stick and ball game just hockey, regardless whether it was played on land or on ice. Some people played these on-ice stick and ball games with skates, some played without, some played with small curved sticks, others with large curved sticks, some played with a leather ball, others with a rock or a wooden projectile. The only unifying theme of all these on-ice stick and ball games was that there was some kind of an object to hit, a stick to hit it with, and it was played on ice. This video is brought to you by my patrons and my merch. The Slavic Sun and Moon t-shirts are back in stock, and the classic M-Laser logo hoodie is always there. If you like my videos, please consider either supporting me for just £1 on Patreon, or if you want something physical for your money, buy my merch. The merch is pretty good quality, and it's subtle so you can wear it anywhere, and it might even make a good Christmas present for someone, just saying. Back to the video. These early modern European on-ice stick and ball games developed during the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was a period from roughly 1300 to 1850 when temperatures were lower on average, resulting in more consistently cold winters in Europe, which meant that canals in the Netherlands, the Thames River in London, or even the canals in Venice could and did consistently freeze over. This meant that the climate conditions in Europe in the early modern period were particularly well suited to the development of a game that was played on ice. However, other than short snippets of texts here and there and sporadic paintings of frozen lake scenes from the 16th century onwards, we don't really have much information about these early on-ice stick and ball games. It was only in the 19th century that references to on-ice stick and ball games started to show up in the written record much more consistently. For example, in an 1892 book on the history of ice skating in England, C.G. Taboot starts a chapter on ice hockey by saying, "The game of bandy, otherwise known as hockey and shinny or shinty, is doubtless one of the earliest pastimes of the kind ever known. In its most primitive form, it is simply played down the middle of a village street by boys who, armed with bent sticks, make themselves warm on a winter's evening." It is certain that during the last century, the game was played and even matches were held on Bury Fen, but it was not until the Great Frost of 1813 and 14 that tradition gives place to certainty, when the army of Napoleon retreating from Moscow were starved and frozen to death by thousands, when the scarcity of coal at Cambridge was so great that the trees within the grounds of St. John's College were cut down for fuel, and in all the colleges we are told the men sat in their rooms 2 and 3 together for warmth. Then the hardy watermen, gunners and labourers were quickening their circulation by playing bandy on Bury Fen. This passage showcases that an on-ice stick and ball game, which in England was primarily called bandy, became particularly popular in the fens in the 19th century and dated all the way to the 18th century, at least. This is corroborated by other sources, such as an 1838 English sporting newspaper mentioning that a game was being played on the frozen fens called bandy or hockey, and was played with sticks and a ball. In fact, despite England not being considered one of the major hockey nations of Europe today, it was in England that the first ever rules for a European on-ice stick and ball game were codified. In 1882, representatives from multiple fens bandy or hockey teams gathered in St. Ives to write down the rules for the game, which they officially called both bandy and hockey on ice, as they themselves couldn't decide on what to name the game. The game, which was varyingly called bandy or hockey, was to be played with curved sticks, a solid ball, on ice and with skates on a football-sized field, with the goals, just like in rugby, football or American football, being placed 10 to 15 yards from the ends of the field. The game had 10 to 15 players on each side, the exact numbers being left to the discretion of the teams organizing each game. It was clear that bandy, in these early stages, still had much variance, with only rough guidelines for the number of players or exact field measurements, as a football-sized field could have meant multiple things in the 19th century. But the fundamental DNA of modern hockey was very much there. There were sticks, skates, a projectile, goals with spaces behind them, and most importantly, it was all played on ice. Since the rules for a European on-ice stick and ball game were first codified in England, it was the English version of the game that became the most popular in Europe. In the late 19th century, the many varieties of on-ice stick and ball games being played all across Europe gave way to the new standardized version that came from England. In fact, at the turn of the century, some European countries called the game English bandy, since as far as continental Europeans were concerned, bandy came from England. However, the most common name across Europe for this game remained simply hockey or ice hockey, or sometimes English hockey. Since English bandy required a lot of natural ice, the game only caught on in countries which at the time had consistent negative temperatures during winters, such as northern and alpine France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, northern Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. In all these countries, sports clubs that either existed before the codification of bandy, like the Viennese Ice Skating Club, or new sports clubs like the Stockholm Hockey Club, would form English bandy teams and start competing in ad hoc matches or tournaments against each other. Following this expansion of English hockey on the continent in the last quarter of the 19th century, the National Bandy Association was founded in England in 1891, which was also the first year that an international bandy hockey game took place in the Netherlands between the English Bury Fen Club and the Dutch bandy teams in Haarlem and Amsterdam. At the turn of the century, what some called bandy or English bandy and others simply hockey was played all across Northern Europe. Hockey teams had been traveling between Prague and Berlin to play each other since 1899, and the Berlin SC hockey team traveled to Davos in 1900 to play against Swiss hockey players and English hockey players who often spent their winter holidays in the Swiss Alps. The Swiss, with their alpine climate and cold, long winters, were always avid supporters of winter sports like skiing or ice skating. So when English holidaymakers brought the codified version of bandy to Switzerland in the 1880s, the Swiss were quick to pick it up, with teams from Davos and St. Moritz competing in annual matches since 1895. Meanwhile, in Sweden, the game of bandy became a popular upper-class pastime, with both men's and women's teams competing against each other. At the turn of the century, there was no doubt that English bandy became a popular winter sport all across Northern Europe. Even Thibaut remarked that bandy, or as it is often called, hockey on the ice, is too good of a game to have been always confined to one district of England. This is where we acknowledge that Canada exists. As we have discussed, Europeans have played some kind of stick and ball games on ice at least since the 16th century, and when many of these Europeans colonized North America, they brought these games with them. However, just like in Europe, it was only in the 19th century that any kind of standardization of rules for an on-ice stick and ball game occurred. In Canada, this happened in 1875 in Montreal, where some upper-class English gentlemen organized an on-ice stick and ball game, the rules of which they also wrote down. This 1875 game is seen as the beginning of modern ice hockey, which at the time was called Montreal hockey, because it was in Montreal that the rules for this specific type of hockey were first written down. What was Montreal hockey? Well, according to the 1875 rules, Montreal hockey was played with 9 players on each side, with a puck and a flat-bladed stick. Forward passes were not allowed, and most importantly, the game was primarily indoors, and played on a smaller size rink than English bandy or other version of on-ice stick and ball games played in North America at the time. The last 2 rules meant that Montreal hockey had an advantage over other stick and ball games. First, by being mostly played indoors, the game wasn't dependent on the unpredictability of weather, and second, by playing on a smaller rink, the game was faster and more physical, which made it more appealing to the spectators. Of course, it took a while for the Montreal version of hockey to be adopted across North America, and during that time the game underwent several changes, such as lowering the number of players from 9 to 7. However, at the turn of the century, the Montreal version of hockey, also called Canadian hockey or just hockey, was firmly established on the continent, with multiple hockey leagues and hundreds of hockey teams competing against each other. The first recorded game in Europe of Canadian hockey occurred in 1895 at Buckingham Palace, where the sons of Lord Stanley, the creator of the Stanley Cup, challenged the future kings of England, Edward VII and George V, to a game of hockey. Members of the royal household and some MPs from the House of Commons also joined in on the game, which took place in February on the Buckingham Palace Gardens frozen lake. According to the newspaper reports from the time, the Prince's team won the game 8-5. Despite such royal support for Canadian hockey in 1895, it wasn't until the first decade of the 20th century that European hockey teams started to play the Canadian version of the game over English bandy. France and Britain, both having cultural and political connections with Canada, were the first countries to see hockey teams switch from English bandy to Canadian hockey in 1902, in both cases being helped in doing so by Canadian immigrants. In Germany, the story was much the same. A North American dentist named Charles Hartley moved to Germany in 1906. Right after his move, he saw the local German bandy teams play, and it reminded him of Canadian hockey, which he used to play back home. He eventually persuaded some of the German teams to play a couple of games in the Canadian style of the game. This proved to be a great success, as the Germans quickly took to the new version of the game, and Canadian hockey became a big hit in the country, just as it did in France and Britain a couple of years earlier. The reasons why Canadian hockey slowly started to take over English bandy in Europe were the same reasons why Montreal hockey became popular in North America, i.e. it was played indoors and on a smaller rink. However, simply being indoors and having a smaller rink wasn't enough to convince everyone in Europe to suddenly switch to playing the Canadian version of the game. This is where the Oxford Canadians come in. Oxford was the preeminent university of the British Empire, which meant that it had many students from all over the empire, including Canada. When Canadian students started to arrive at Oxford in large numbers at the turn of the century, they brought with them the Canadian version of hockey. They quickly founded the Oxford Canadian hockey team in 1905/6 and started to play Canadian hockey games, not just against Cambridge in the annual varsity match, but also against any other British and European teams that would challenge them. Many Europeans at the time were fascinated with Canadian version of the game. English bandy was a slower, more strategic game like football. However, Canadian hockey, and especially Canadian hockey played by Canadians, was a fast, quick-paced, physical game that impressed a lot of Europeans who wanted to see the Canadians play. This meant that from 1906 onwards, the Oxford Canadians traveled across Europe and played against various European teams in the Canadian version of the game, thus popularizing Canadian hockey over English bandy. Since bandy already had a governing body established in 1891, the European hockey clubs that switched to the Canadian hockey in the first decade of the 20th century felt the need to establish a new governing body for the Canadian version of the game. Therefore, in 1908, representatives from the two main European countries that switched to playing Canadian hockey first, France and England, along with the representatives from Belgium and Switzerland, met in Paris and established what would become the IIHF. However, despite the Oxford Canadians promoting Canadian hockey all across Europe, and despite the IIHF being established as early as 1908, the process of switching from the English version of the game to the Canadian version of the game was still gradual. Some clubs never even made the switch, and other clubs, rather than completely switching to Canadian hockey, simply started fielding teams in both versions of the game. Another issue the fledgling IIHF had to contend with was the ever-present problem of rule inconsistency across Europe. Even before the Canadian version of the game arrived in Europe, rule inconsistency was a major problem. Many European bandy teams would often play slightly different variations of the game, and before international matches, they would have to meet ahead of time to agree on what rules they would follow during the game. After all, the initial codification of the rules of bandy wasn't very precise, and standardizing a game across an entire continent at the turn of the century was extremely difficult. To try to solve this issue, the IIHF, before they agreed on any new standardization, set out to first log all the different rules the Canadian hockey playing nations of Europe had. Some examples of the differences in rules included goal size, sizes, which in England were 4x4 feet, while in Switzerland they were 2x2 meters. France played without any rules regarding offsides, while England played with football-style offsides. In England, there was space behind the goal, while in Bohemia, the goal was right at the boards. Meanwhile, Germany was classified by the IIHF as indifferent, meaning there were no consistent hockey rules in Germany, and the German hockey teams varied wildly in what kind of rules they had for the game. IIHF's plan for the standardization of the rules for Canadian hockey in Europe was through international competition. That is, it would be at international IIHF competitions where said rulebook would be created and enforced, which the participating teams would have to learn and afterwards bring back home to their country. This meant that throughout the early 1900s, some hockey clubs, while thinking they were playing, quote, proper Canadian hockey, would show up to IIHF international competition only to find out that their version of Canadian hockey, which I will from now on just call hockey, was quite different to IIHF hockey rules. For example, when the Bohemian national hockey team showed up at the first IIHF international tournament in France in 1909, they realized that the game they had been playing and calling hockey was nowhere close to actual Canadian hockey. A member of the Bohemian team, Jan Paloš, recalled, "When we left for Chamonix to take part in our first international ice hockey tournament, we had no clue about the sport at the time. It was not until we reached Chamonix that we saw, for the first time ever, a few other players from Canada with sticks, proper skates and a puck. We didn't even know the rules of the game. Turns out what the Bohemians have been calling hockey was, in fact, more akin to English bandy rather than Canadian hockey, but they only found that out once they showed up to the tournament. Bohemia unsurprisingly finished last in the 1909 tournament, but they didn't take this loss lying down. To try to improve, in 1911, the secretary of the Bohemian Hockey Association, Josef Laufer, organized a visit from Oxford Canadians to play in Prague against the club Slavia and against the Bohemian national team. The first match against Slavia was a disaster for the Bohemians, with the Oxford Canadians winning 15-0. That's some boyha-looking scoreline. On the second day, the Oxford Canadians were scheduled to play the Bohemian national team, and Laufer was expecting another 15-0, maybe even 20-0. After all, in these early days of European hockey, Canadians often beat European teams by double digits. Most Europeans were simply not ready for the speed and physicality with which the Canadians played the sport. However, to everyone's surprise, the Bohemian national team lost only 4-0. The Bohemians celebrated so much that you would think they won the game. Laufer, ecstatic with joy, exclaimed after the match, "A final score of 4-0? The world has never seen anything like it." The practice against the Oxford Canadians paid off, as Bohemia went on to win the next two IIHF competitions. In fact, playing against Canadian teams, especially the Oxford Canadians, was a very common way of practicing the game for many early European hockey teams. In 1913, a German sports journal stated that European teams playing against the Oxford Canadians have learned much. In particular, the Berlin SC has to thank this club for their progress in Canadian ice hockey. Before World War I, just like bandy a decade prior, hockey was clearly on the rise in Europe, with each consecutive year garnering more support for the game, more players, and more teams switching to playing it instead of bandy. By 1914, Britain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, and Sweden were all members of the IIHF. When World War I started, most hockey-related activities were put on hold as wartime rationing was in effect and many hockey players were drafted to fight in the war. However, after the war, perhaps the most important event in ice hockey's history took place. But we will have to discuss that in the next video. Thank you to all my patrons and to everyone who has bought merch in the past few months. You really do keep the channel going. Also, as always, special thanks to my deity tier patrons Kim and Rohan. My name is mlaser, and stick around for history.